The computer role-playing game, or CRPG for short, is the only genre among all video game genres that has managed to escape from its deathbed and revive itself 3 times since its inception as one of the first video game genres. You can't find a genre in video game history that has played such a big role in shaping today's industry standards that has come so close to falling into oblivion. Of all the forgotten genres of video games, the CRPG genre has perhaps the most bizarre place possible. Each time the revival of this genre has been accompanied by a very big and influential event. In fact, looking back at the history of CRPG, you might think that the developers have always used the genre as a means of making big changes rather than creating a CRPG game. Baldur's Gate and Fallout caused the genre to suddenly become one of the most recognizable genres of its time for a few years. The reason for this popularity, again, is the introduction of extremely extensive narrative and story elements and their choices and influences that have led to a redefinition of not only the CRPG, but all the standards of video game storytelling. It was in the early 2010s that the CRPG was revived for the second time. The entry of blockbuster games into the 7th generation video game arena and the intense streaming line of the industry had caused CRPGs to be completely sidelined. It was in the meantime that studios like Obsidian and Larian decided to launch their CRPGs in a new way called Kickstarter. Kickstarters for CRPG titles were so successful that they expanded this style of video game financing into other genres, eventually giving rise to big, well-known CRPGs like Pillars of Eternity and lesser CRPG titles like Divinity Original Sin. After the enormous success of DOS2, CRPG was once again forgotten. Many studios had realized that creating CRPG titles wasn't that simple, and that the usual formula would no longer be responsive. While this is clear to all fans of the genre, and even masterpieces like Disco Elysium have been made, CRPG didn't see much activity until 2023, when the full version of Baldur's Gate 3 was released. With the release of the first CRPG in history, with the style and budget of a 3-play game, Larian once again showed everyone that the CRPG genre is not forget, but by modernizing the strengths of this genre, it is possible to make one of the best titles in history. In the midst of all these revivals, recurring forgetfulness and reminiscences that upset all the equations of the industry every time, lies a very important question. Why don't we like CRPG? After 1995, with the introduction of extensive story elements into CRPGs, the genre became practically a full-fledged simulation of the popular board games of the 1980s and 1990s, the likes of which had only been seen in text adventure titles until then. With the arrival of this element, CRPG practically became one of those genres that had its own audience. Due to the lack of sufficient facilities and budget, the storytelling method in these titles were long texts that were placed without any restrictions between each and every quest, side quests, and even simple and superficial interactions of the games. When video games became fast-paced and thrilling titles with cinematic storytelling and extremely high budgets, the new generation of gamers quickly lost interest in reading long-form texts. To be honest, reading books in video games was no longer something that piqued the interest of most people. Initially, and sometimes even to this day, many developers tried to maintain this storytelling method due to its high costs and ease of implementation, and CRPGs continued to follow in an era when motion capture and sophisticated animation systems were entering the world of video games. This swim against the tide not only didn't retain the CRPG's previous position, but it also made the genre one that very few people were interested in, and the decline in studio interest in making titles in this genre only exacerbated this declining trend. This happened during the next generations of CRPGs, with the addition of full voice acting and 100% for all game texts, and with the release of BG3, the cinematic and costly storytelling style slowly led to a return to the CRPG genre, and this genre occasionally attracted the attention of people. Perhaps the main reason for this CRPG's isolation is our taste and attention span as the blockbuster generation of gamers. In an industry where even the smallest published works focus on their narrative style and take it out of the one-dimensional style, text or audio, CRPGs who still like to show long texts can't find a special place for themselves. Perhaps the most obvious contemporary examples of CRPGs that attempted to add voice acting were the titles Pillars of Eternity 2 and Divinity Original Sin 2. These titles weren't the first CRPGs to add voice acting to the CRPG's storytelling mix, but they can be called the first titles to try to reach the level of full voice acting in the game. PoE 2 was unsuccessful in its attempt. Even though all of the main characters in the game were fully voiced in many of the important conversations, the most important texts of the game, the texts spoken by the narrator, are still voiceless, and the audience is forced to switch between hearing and seeing. However, in DOS 2, all the text in the game is fully voiced, and finally, the title was able to engage the audience so much that it has enough time to show them its other positive features. BG3 is also the first modern CRPG title to not only be fully voiced, but also to become one of the most engaging and exciting storytellers and subplotters in the video game industry using motion capture and cinematic narration. Many may disagree with this and consider reasons such as the freedom of imagination and the simplicity of textual storytelling to be among the reasons for the superiority of tall texts of older CRPGs, but the truth is that this style of storytelling, with all its strengths, is no longer one of the choices that can be used in making video games, and whether you like it or not, the majority of people who, in today's world, they are interested in playing video games, and they don't even come close to reading long texts. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the Elder Scrolls series is the incredibly high ability of each of the titles in the series to turn the scary and complex parts of the RPG genre into elements that are very simple and understandable to new players. The series was able to turn the complex build system, many of which even prevented players from advancing through titles like Diablo 2 or Fallout, into simple but efficient systems, completely erasing this scary element from the genre and even inviting other titles to do the same. CRPGs, even many of the modern titles in this genre, gave their audience a wide range of personalization choices. This may seem appealing to many at first, but it scares newcomers when they realize that you could be deprived of the game without a proper guide and experience to max your character's stats. The personalization of characters in CRPG titles has never been more appealing than what we see today. The existence of stats, skills, and even traits and backgrounds that each need to be adjusted and ensure that they are in perfect harmony with each other has been complex and tedious not only for many players today, but also for many who entered the world of video games just looking for a simple hobby. One of the reasons we don't like CRPG is that most titles in this genre still haven't been able to escape the system. In fact, one of the strengths and weaknesses of CRPGs is their excessive attention to style and, even worse, to the rules of the board games on which they are based. In fact, when it comes to gameplay, many CRPGs, instead of focusing on the parts that appeal to today's audience, quickly become immersed in their CRPGs and spend all their creativity building new role-playing systems. It's not a bad thing to have personalization at all. Even having different factors in personalizing characters is attractive and innovative. But when all of these factors are just the same numbers and ways to achieve a certain goal, they're not appealing to those who aren't interested in playing with numbers, even though they're appealing to a lot of people. Many audiences see the change not in more numbers, but with their own eyes, opening up new ways to achieve goals, adding appearance features to show the character becoming more powerful, e.g., what WoW does by donating more powerful and engaging items as the player becomes stronger, are all among the things that can lead the CRPG down a more mainstream path. The CRPG genre focuses heavily on the exploration of the environment. Finding new environments, finding loots, finding new events, etc., are all fundamental design principles of CRPGs. This is not a problem in itself, but when the only interaction of the audience with the game during the sections that make up the majority of the game is walking and looting, many audiences prefer to go for another title that is more appealing to them. This problem should be broken down into two parts. First, the lack of sufficient interactions by the audience with the game during the environment discovery phase, and second, the player's lesser role during the fights than the action titles and even ARPG. Different titles have different ways to add audience engagement with the environment, using scripted events, adding hidden collectibles and items, adding platforming challenges, puzzles, and most importantly, enemies that keep the player constantly in the gameplay. Because of their special combat structure, CRPGs can't keep the player facing a wave of enemies. In many cases, even most of the encounters you have with enemies are designed manually, so you can't expect to have as many enemies in different parts of the game. However, chance encounters are also considered in-game events and are therefore highly repetitive. On the other hand, factors such as puzzles are usually a weakened version of the puzzles of old adventure games, which are due to various reasons such as engine limitations, camera angles, lack of sufficient animations, etc. For many casual gamers, they seem boring and superficial. Perhaps the only CRPG titles that have been able to incorporate something called exploration and platforming are games made by Larian. By leaning more towards today's open-world style and rendering their world completely, a world that is usually divided into tiles apart in other CRPGs, these titles have a way to add other features of open-world games to these games as well, and as a result, almost all environments have a lot of details and different ways and even puzzles to engage the audience. Features that not only include exploration, but also add a new dimension to the combat. That being said, the combats in CRPG titles can't appeal to today's audience as much as they should because of too much attention to form, which is perhaps the biggest culprit being BG3 itself. Exploring this issue requires another long video, and it doesn't fit into this video in detail, but it can be said that perhaps the biggest problem with CRPGs in attracting a modern audience is the strong interest of the form of this style in showing numbers rather than actions. In most games today, special attention is paid to animations and their implementation in sections such as the fights of these titles. This is because as video games become a costly and expensive hobby, audiences of all styles will also like to see more details such as different animations, special visual effects, and so on. The CRPG genre, however, doesn't care about this for the most part, and even in many of today's CRPG titles, a few very simple animations, waving a sword or firing a small blue ball, are the creator's best efforts to add action to these titles. Even though titles like BG3 try to add elements such as physics, environmental challenges and opportunities, detailed animations, etc., but paying too much attention to numbers and complex computational rules for today's audience of board games still leaves audiences not having enough patience to get to the more exciting stages of the fights. Perhaps it should be said that the CRPG genre should finally undergo that revolutionary revision in itself. This has happened to almost all other genres over the last 20 years, not only rewriting them but also extending their popularity. The acclaimed title Baldur's Gate 3 is the best example in almost every way to emulate, as well as improve some elements to reach the true potential of the genre. Making expensive and long big games like BG3 may not be possible for everyone, but streamlining this style, accepting the tastes of today's audience, and paying attention to today's standards of game development can all be among the solutions that can easily turn the CRPG genre into one of the well-known and popular genres that can be in line with other styles towards the future should take steps.